surrounding Gostomel Airport were relieved by forces of Rosgvardia and the Ministry of Defense. Despite the change in initial plans, Command still hoped to conclude the operation quickly without escalating into a full-scale war. The VDV columns, having moved from Belarusian territory on their own strength and positioned near the village of Blistavice in Bucha district, received orders to break through to Kiev. Two columns were formed. One moved south toward Irpin. Upon reaching the outskirts of Bucha, the columns split. One turned onto Institutskaya Street, toward the bridge over the Irpin River, where Kemerovo Omon unit has been ambushed shortly before. The other continued south along Vokzalnaya Street. At the intersection of Vokzalnaya and Shevchenko Streets, this column encountered its first ambush organized by local defense forces. Some attackers wore civilian clothing. Fire also came from residential buildings, and the civilian minibus was used to move part of the attacking group, an early example of the Ukrainian territorial defense's future tactics, using civilians and their vehicles for attacks on Russian forces. The column repelled the attack and continued south. Local residents, taking advantage of the airborne troopers' orders not to engage locals or respond to provocations, approached the road unafraid, filmed the passing military vehicles, and actively reported the column's location and composition to Ukrainian forces. After crossing the Bucha River via the bridge near the Giraffe shopping center, the column encountered a barricade made of a forklift and a concrete mixer. Orders were given to turn back in search of a bypass route. At that moment, the forward group was ambushed and suffered losses. The main force of the column, after turning around and returning to Bucha on Vokzalnaya Street, came under a massive airstrike, destroying most of its vehicles. Some vehicles were trapped on the street and abandoned by their crews. After picking up the wounded and leaving a small post near the destroyed column, airborne troopers withdraw north to link with a column that had previously moved along Institutskaya Street. Local residents who had been filming the aftermath hurried to report it to Ukrainian forces near the Giraffe shopping center. Consequently, they decided to move north to collect trophies. Seeing enemy forces, larger and supported by combat vehicles advancing from Irpin, the airborne post withdrew without engaging, following the main forces. Ukraine thus gained its first truly high-profile PR victory. Photos of the burned column spread worldwide and were actively used in Ukrainian propaganda for a long time. The site became a focal point for foreign journalists and various international delegations. But events continued to unfold. On the 1st and the 2nd of March, Russian forces began withdrawing from Bucha, pulling back toward Gostomel Airport. On the 2nd of March, believing the Russian army was retreating, Ukrainian command formed assault units that entered Bucha from Irpin. Boastful reports appeared on Ukrainian television claiming the AFU seized the initiative and that Russians were fleeing, while Ukrainians filmed triumphant videos and raised flags at the Bucha City Council. A Russian airborne assault column began maneuvering to outflank the Ukrainian forces in Bucha. By the end of the 2nd of March, it had reached its starting positions near Vorzel, where an important road junction is located. Ukrainian artillery opened chaotic fire at the advancing Russian forces, damaging civilian buildings and killing peaceful residents. Members of the Ukrainian territorial defense, who had just the day before proudly posed for cameras and claimed they set up ambushes for the Muscovites, now abandoned their weapons en masse and in civilian clothing tried to hide among ordinary Bucha residents. At the same time, another part of the VDV forces, despite airstrikes and constant artillery shelling, made a dash toward the western outskirts of Irpin, where they prepared for the next push. The entire month of March passes in protracted positional battles with a slow but inexorable advance of the Russian army. Despite numerous counterattacks, the AFU fails to achieve any significant successes. The main media narrative is driven by Ukrainian SRGs exploiting the lack of continuous territorial control by Russian forces to infiltrate their rear. The population in areas liberated from Kiev's authority increasingly cooperates with Russian forces, receiving humanitarian aid. During this time, peace negotiations take place in Istanbul and conclude successfully. Peace begins to shimmer on the horizon. However, leaders of Western Europe issue a statement that Kiev cannot sign a peace agreement while its capital is under blockade, referring to Russian forces surrounding the Ukrainian capital. The Russian leadership decides on a gesture of goodwill the withdrawal of Russian forces from Kiev, Sumy, and Chernigov regions. The army receives the order: "We are pulling out." But this does not stop Ukrainians. Having failed to defeat Russian troops in open battle, Ukrainian SRGs strive to bite the departing units as hard as possible. Russian troops left the Kiev region. Yet the fear of Russian airborne troops is so great that Ukrainian forces enter Bucha and Gostomel, abandoned by Russians, only a few days later. Ukrainian television broadcasts triumphant reports about the liberation of settlements in the Kiev region. The mayor of Bucha announces that the city is back under Ukrainian control. Police conduct a raid through the city's streets almost live, and it seems peace has finally arrived. However, as it turned out at the very moment Boris Johnson, then Prime Minister of Great Britain, had already said his words to Zelensky, then President of Ukraine, "Let's just fight." A few days after the liberation of Bucha, a curfew is suddenly imposed in the city. Civilians are forbidden to go outside and film. Makeshift teams from volunteer battalions enter the city and begin a cleanup. Those who allegedly collaborated with Russian forces are identified, and calls to report on unreliable neighbors spread among the population of Bucha and Irpin. A couple of days later, an informational bomb about the massacre in Bucha suddenly explodes. Simultaneously, all major publications in Western countries run similar articles and photographs about the alleged genocide of the population in Bucha. The public is stirred by stories of mass graves, of executed civilians, etc. Mass hysteria from Western leaders drowns out voices asking uncomfortable questions about the tragedy that occurred. The gesture of goodwill is interpreted by Kiev as Russia's weakness, and the so-called Russian war crime, which happened so conveniently, is used by Kiev to justify breaking the reached agreements and continuing hostilities. The war gains momentum.